Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we are finishing up our discussion on Beowulf. So let's get into it. Also, apologies for the wound on my head. I lost a fight with an electrical box at work, but I'm fine. So anyways, ignoring that, move on to Beowulf. Today we're talking about his battle with the dragon. Alright, so we're going to start off with a bit of a recap of what's happened so far. So, after sailing to Denmark to rid Hrothgar's kingdom of the monster Grendel and Grendel's mother, Beowulf returns home to the land of the Geats in triumph, and we get a bit of a time jump at this point. We learn that the folks in Geatland really wanted Beowulf to be king, but when Hygelac, the current king, is killed, and Beowulf is offered the throne, his queen kind of offers him the throne, even above her own son, because she says, "You're going to do better." He says, nope, I don't want it. I don't want to be king. Hygelac's son can take over, and he's fine, and that's okay. But then when he's killed, Beowulf sort of has to take the throne because there really isn't anyone else left, and Geatland needs to be sort of stable because there's a lot of enemies that they have kind of around that would love to invade and take over. And if there's no strong king, it would be very easy for them to do that. So Beowulf says, fine, I'll take over, but I don't want to be king, really. But this just kind of makes everyone trust him more. It's sort of like, because he doesn't aspire to power, that the people sort of think that he's better off being a ruler. So he rules for 50 years. Everything's great. He's an old man at this point, and he's wondering kind of what his legacy is going to be. And a thief, just a random person, steals a golden cup from the hoard of a dragon who's just sort of nearby. Just sort of, oh, by the way, there's a dragon nearby. And someone steals a golden cup from the dragon's hoard. Now, it depends on which translation you read. In most of the older translations, in fact, in every other translation I've read, the dragon is male. And in Maria Devana Headley's translation, which is the one that I read for this lesson, the dragon's female. So that also adds a bit of an interesting dynamic as well. But it doesn't really change the story. It just sort of changes the dynamic of sort of why the dragon would be so angry at having been stolen from. But anyways, that's something you can also kind of think about on your own. So Beowulf goes to fight the dragon. He does kill it, but the dragon's teeth are poisoned, and so he gets bitten at one point, and the dragon's poison eventually kills him. And so the poem ends with a funeral, and it's kind of a bit open-ended because it ends with, everyone saying, well, who's going to protect us now? Curtain. And that's it. So it's kind of a grim ending, and it leaves the reader with a lot of questions, but I think it adds a lot of drama to the story. I really like this third section. My favorite section is the battle with Grendel's mother, but this third section is so ambiguous, and it's not a neat and tidy conclusion. And so it kind of sticks with you longer because of that, I think. I don't know. I really like it. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask is sort of, what's the deal with this section? So it feels kind of like a sequel to the story, or like a coda to the story. It's sort of like you finish the main campaign and there's like a DLC that you play afterwards that sets things up for maybe a future game or whatnot. So, what's the deal? Is this like the Trespasser DLC to the Inquisition main story? I'm sorry, I had to. I think when you read all of this together in one go, the whole poem, you really kind of understand what this third section is doing. It isn't something that was sort of tacked on. It isn't something that was sort of a separate story that was adapted to fit into the Beowulf thing. This is very much, we're pretty confident that the whole thing was composed in a group. It was written down by two different scribes, and they had kind of different writing styles and whatnot. But for the most part, we're pretty confident that Beowulf as a whole, the whole 3-part poem, is like one continuous thing. And you see that when you read it, because there's not like chapter breaks. There's like, when you read the Odyssey, for example, it's very obvious when like a book ends and then the next one starts, because like it stops and then you have, you know, book 7 and then it starts, and it's very much a different part of the narrative. But with this one, the story just sort of flows very continuously. We get sort of his return from, you know, Denmark, and then he's welcomed, and then he explains to King Hygelac sort of what happened, and he kind of does a bit of a recap of the events of the first 2 sections. And then it's kind of brief. We get sort of like, oh, and then, you know, Hygelac's killed, and then his son, you know, takes over because Beowulf refuses the throne, and then he's killed by his enemies, and then Beowulf takes over, and now he's king. And then it sort of says like, and he ruled for 50 winters. And so you're kind of like, it isn't one of those things where it feels like there's like an ending and then it's like, oh, and then this thing was added on later. It doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like one continuous story, because there isn't really yes, there's a cat. There isn't really one part where it sort of like explicitly cuts off and then you can see kind of the seams. It sort of moves from one to the next. So, a bit of trivia here. The original manuscript of this poem doesn't have a title. It's part of a bigger collection. I think there's like 3 works in the document itself, and Beowulf is sort of in the second section. And it's called Beowulf because scholars have kind of called it that. So it's not really like the official name. It doesn't really have a name. It's kind of like, you know, if you look at like the books of the Old Testament, in the original like Hebrew and Aramaic and all that stuff, there is no like title. Like they weren't really called like Genesis or Numbers, because like Genesis is a Greek word, Numbers is an English word, and English didn't even exist when that book was being written. So it's very much like those are titles that we added after the fact, and were kind of added in. So the original, you know, they didn't have titles. The original kind of, I guess, title for like the book of Genesis would have just been sort of the first word, which is sort of like in the beginning, and that's kind of what it was called. I think the word is like Breshit or something like that. I don't know, but it just is sort of like in the beginning is sort of what it's called. But then later on, it sort of gets retroactively named Genesis, and so we call it the Book of Genesis. And so moving on. Anyways, so Beowulf doesn't really have a title, but it's called Beowulf because it's about the person. And it's not about the person in the sense that the Conan stories are about Conan. That's kind of a slightly different thing, but it's a very similar kind of character. Conan the Cimmerian was created by Robert E. Howard. He was a friend of H.P. Lovecraft, so it was like early 20th century. And all of his stories, he wrote a ton of them. There's one novel and then a bunch of novellas and short stories. And even though they all take place at sort of different points in Conan's life, he's very much kind of the same character, whether he's like a rogue mercenary or like the king of a nation. He still feels like the same person, and it's basically just different adventures that he has, and there's no threat too big for him to overcome it. So there's monsters, and there's evil wizards, and there's, you know, enemy armies and magic and everything, and he just sort of does his duty and protects the innocent and fights bad guys and punches things in the face really hard, and that's like his whole deal. I genuinely really like the Conan stories. Now there is a little bit of like growth in that he eventually gets more and more reputation and sort of regard by others. He sort of builds up a reputation, and so he eventually becomes a king, and you know, it's very different from his kind of early days where he was a sort of a grubby mercenary just sort of looking for work. But for the most part, Conan is very much like a fixed point at the center of like a big rotating wheel. And so no matter what is going on around here, Conan is sort of always the same. And Beowulf in the first two parts does feel like that kind of character. But when you get to the third part, he all of a sudden has a character arc. He's not just sort of big hero guy who shows up, kills monster 1, and then kills monster 2, and there was much rejoicing. Now we get to see him, he's older, he's kind of doubting whether or not he's still able to do what made him famous in his younger years. And there's a bit of self-doubt there, and we see that he isn't like the superhero that he was kind of early on. He is still a cunning warrior, he's still a good ruler, all of that, but he's a lot more frail, and not frail, but he's a lot more flawed and fallible at this point in his life. And the poem does tell us that Beowulf's reigned for like 50 years. So we know that the Geats have enjoyed 50 years of peace and prosperity and stability, and that's a really impressive thing, because throughout this section of the poem we get a sense of kind of what the political situation is in that part of the world, and we know that there's lots of other rulers and factions who are all sort of circling and waiting for an opportunity to attack. It's kind of like in the Odyssey. I'm going to go back to the Odyssey a lot because I just read it. But the reason why Penelope doesn't declare Odysseus dead is because she knows that if he does, there will be a civil war, because all of the other powers in nearby kingdoms will try to make a play for it. If there's no strong ruler to give the area stability, everyone else will sort of swarm in and want to take over. And the suitors are all there, and they'll start fighting each other to see who wins. And then whoever wins is going to then have to defend Ithaca from everyone else who's going to try to attack, because a brand new ruler with no family to speak of isn't going to be a terribly strong ruler. This is also one reason why Penelope doesn't really want Telemachus to sort of take over and inherit his father's kingdom, because she doesn't really believe at that point that he's strong enough to maintain the stability. And so all she can do is just delay the inevitable for as long as she can, in the off chance that Odysseus can come back, or that she can maybe, who knows, maybe she'll get another ally somehow who can defend Ithaca. But it's very, very precarious. And so in this part 3 of Beowulf, we've got Geatland, who's kind of in a similar thing. We've got, and their king is old, and everyone is just sort of hoping that they'll have a chance. We learn that King Hygelac was killed by his enemies, and then his son was then killed, through treachery as well. And so if Beowulf hadn't taken over, Geatland would have been invaded, and these other kingdoms would have swept in and taken over. And so he's, again, sort of a stopgap at this point. But because of this, we see some change in Beowulf's character. We see his character arc, because it's not just about him fighting monsters and winning, it's about what he thinks about his own legacy. And so in part 3, we get him looking back at what he did in, the good old days, and he's sort of wondering, can I still do that? And then, of course, the dragon shows up and gives him a chance to make that decision of whether or not he wants to recapture those glory days or not. Yes. So, as I mentioned before in previous lectures, the phrase "that was a good king" recurs in this section as well. We hear stories throughout the poem of sort of other kings who are good, who are known for being good kings. And they're good for a number of different reasons. One of them is like they're good for presiding over stable periods. They're good for keeping the peace. They're good for defending their people against threats. They're good for being strong in battle, that kind of thing. And we're told in this section that everyone thought Beowulf was a good king. They sort of saw him that way, and he's kind of wrestling with that, because the state of being a good king is not like a medal that you get once and then you can just sort of coast on that for the rest of your reign. It's very much something you have to continually sort of prop up. You have to continually reinforce it by being good, you know, in the long run. And so when Beowulf at this point is old, and if we assume that maybe in part 1 he was, you know, in his 20s or so, at this point he's in his 70s. So even like for that day and age, he would have been considered quite old, because the life expectancy was much shorter than it was today. So he's in his 70s at least, maybe older, and he's really wrestling with this fact that, you know, am I still a good king? Am I going to be remembered for being a good king? What's the deal? And we have to kind of see him dealing with that. And the dragon gives him a chance to kind of fully confront his legacy firsthand. And when the poem ends and everyone kind of holds his funeral, there's this sort of pervading sense of dread that kind of suffuses those last few parts, because he was sort of the stability, or he was like the linchpin that was holding everything together. And now that he's gone, he didn't have an heir. He never got married. He never had a son. And so there's no one else who can carry on this period of stability. And by today's standards, that seems like a kind of an odd, you know, an odd ending. It's like we would expect a sequel where we would have either another hero who would come in and, you know, bring stability, or we would watch sort of the enemy take over and try to maintain that stability, and then see how the next generation would carry on. I don't know, but it's a very kind of sad, sort of tragic ending, because it's like this is the end of their piece, and that's kind of sad. Because it ends on a sad note, I think that forces us to ask a question. And so one of these questions is, was him going to face the dragon justified? He has many loyal soldiers under his command. There may have been others who could have fought the dragon. Beowulf goes to face it himself. And like, why do you think that is? And do you think he was right to do that, especially since his death leaves Geatland so vulnerable to attack from outside? Was his choice to fight the dragon justified because of his record? Was literally no one else able to do this? Or was it sort of a desperate attempt to recapture the energy of his youth? If you think of Beowulf the way we would think of like a superhero, I'm thinking of, okay, think of Batman, because he's sort of one of the superheroes who's just like a normal guy, but he's, you know, really strong and really smart. And if in the Batman kind of multiverse, there's two different ways that we see him handling him getting old. There's Batman Beyond, where he doesn't fight crime anymore, but his protege does. And so he finds someone younger, more capable to pass on his knowledge, to mentor, and he lets them be the hero while he kind of accepts the fact that he's too old to continue doing this and that Gotham deserves better. The other option is something like The Dark Knight Returns, which is a lot more nihilistic, I guess. But in that one, you've got Batman who's like, literally no one else could fight evil, and so he has to sort of come out of retirement and keep the order, because he doesn't trust anyone else to do it, and everything's falling apart and all that. And I'm probably oversimplifying this. I have The Dark Knight Returns on my shelf right there, but it's been a couple of years since I've read it. So if I'm getting any details wrong, let me know. But what I remember, the gist of that was he comes out of retirement because there's sort of no one else. He's kind of the last hope of Gotham City. And in both of those cases, you kind of can justify his decision because the situation sort of calls for it. In, you know, Batman Beyond, and I guess in the comics too, there's his proteges do go on to do their own thing. You've got you know, Dick Grayson, who was Robin. He goes on to become Nightwing, who's his own superhero in his own right, and he, you know, continues to fight crime. We love Nightwing. But in this case, in kind of the Beowulf world, it's a different culture, and it doesn't, like, it isn't a super cut and dry decision. When he says, I have to be the one to fight the dragon, he gives a big long speech about sort of his exploits in the past. And you can read it in a couple different ways. So you can interpret it as it was a good decision because there's literally no one else. The poem doesn't really give us a lot of information about the other people that could have fought the dragon. We learn about Wiglaf, but he just, all he does is he sort of brings a sword to Beowulf and says, you know, here, this is my sword. Maybe it'll help you out, especially when he loses his first one, because the dragon's hide is really strong. And so maybe it is justified that he's really the only one who can fight. He's the only one experienced in fighting monsters. He's done outrageous things. At one point we hear that he swam across kind of a channel of water while holding like 30 suits of armor, which, like, that's cartoonishly ridiculous. If you think of 30 suits of armor, so like the armor of 30 people, that would be like this mountainous pile of things, and somehow he managed to like swim while carrying that. And so like that strains credulity a bit. But if he could do something like that, maybe he is sort of the only person with the strength and the endurance to be able to fight this dragon. So if he has sort of, if he's greater than any other person in that kingdom, even at age 70 plus, maybe he was the only person who could fight the dragon, and so he was justified. Now, if there was other people there, maybe they could have fought the dragon, and, you know, in this culture, you know, a victory like that would have been a great source of pride, and it would have sort of proven that person as a hero in their own right. And so if there was someone else who's available, they could have fought the dragon, and they would have won themselves a great deal of glory and renown. And, you know, Beowulf didn't have to die, and so they would have still been stable. But we don't know that because we don't hear about any other heroes who are strong enough or capable enough to do that. And so you can sort of read it either way. Another point that you do have to kind of remember is before he goes to fight the dragon, Beowulf does give a speech where he says that, like, he's aware that he may die in this attempt. So he's not boasting. He's not saying, I'm going to go fight the dragon because only I can kill the dragon. He's saying, I have to be the one to fight the dragon because I'm the only one who stands a chance against the dragon, but there is a chance that I might die. And, you know, I'm just going to leave it. He says, like, I'm going to leave it to God, and whoever, you know, is victorious is sort of the one who is destined to win. So we see that he's not an arrogant person, and he is sort of going into this with very realistic ideas of how things might play out. He's very aware that he might die and that the dragon might continue to be a threat, but he tells them, I have to be the one to go face him first. So that might be something that we could use to sort of come to a conclusion, but there is also the thing of, like, the risk to his entire kingdom if he dies is so great that you wonder, you know, is it really justified? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Now, I think the poem itself is very confident that he was a good king. I don't think the kind of ambiguous ending is meant to cast doubt on the fact that he was a good king. I think it's just, weren't we lucky to have such a good king ruling for us over such a long period? And it's sad that we lost that kind of thing. But, there's different ways to analyze it, and this is a complex poem, and so there's evidence in the text to kind of support different viewpoints. And so that's why we love talking about it, because it's complex. So that is Beowulf. It's one of my favorite things ever. I think I do like the Odyssey a little bit better, but it's still like one of my top favorite works of literature of all time ever. And it's so good, and I always love finding excuses to rant about it. And there's a ton of stuff that I could have talked about that I didn't. And so, if you want to learn more about this, I'm sure there's kind of online classes. I'm sure there's like a great courses lecture on it that goes into a lot more detail. But Beowulf is great, and so I want to share how great it is with everyone. So to finish up this whole 4-part thing, I wanted to talk about adaptations of the Beowulf story that you can read that sort of, it presents the story in a different way. And so I've got three books to talk about. The first one is Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. Now, when you think Michael Crichton, you think like techno thrillers, you think Jurassic Park, you think Congo, Terminal Man, The Andromeda Strain, all of that kind of stuff. But he did also write quite a bit of historical fiction, and his historical fiction is really good. My favorite historical book that he wrote is The Great Train Robbery, which is like a heist film in like the 19th century. It's so good. But this one is also really, really fantastic. And there is a movie version of this, and it's called The 13th Warrior, and it stars Antonio Banderas, and it's also really good. So you should see that. Now, the conceit of this book is that it's like a reconstruction of a lost journal by a Muslim explorer who travels to Scandinavia and fights alongside a group of warriors against a tribe of like Neanderthals who have survived in kind of a pocket of, seclusion. And they're sort of maybe the last Neanderthals, in history kind of thing. And they're seen as sort of a threat by the Scandinavian folks. And so there's a conflict between sort of these two tribes. There's the tribe of Scandinavian people with this observer kind of alongside, and he sort of gets to know them and fights alongside them and sort of gains their respect and all that. And then the Neanderthals sort of represent, the other, the monster. And so you've got, there isn't really one Grendel character, but it's sort of like Grendel is sort of the warriors of the tribe that attack them. And then Grendel's mother is sort of represented as like a high priestess that sort of stays in a cave and directs everything, and she's sort of a holy woman who is very dangerous. And the dragon is it's like when all of the Neanderthals come down out of the mountain, they're all carrying torches, and in the mist, it looks like a really long, fiery serpent. And so that's what the Scandinavian people, they call like the fireworm. And so that's sort of meant to be sort of the dragon. And so it's implied that, well, it's not implied, but it's suggested that sort of the Beowulf story was an adaptation of these real historical events that was then sort of mythologized up and turned into an epic story of a heroic man fighting monsters and all of that. And so it's really, really good. And there's a big essay at the back where Crichton sort of talks about he talks about the Beowulf myth and the way he adapted the story. And I think the journal that he sort of is recreating, it was based off of like, you had like the very, very beginning is a real thing. So like the journal did exist, but it was just like a fragment of the beginning. And so Crichton sort of expands it out, takes artistic license with it, and turns it into this sort of tale. So he sets it up as like, this is a real thing, but like not really. But like it could be a plausible real event that inspired the Beowulf story. and it's really complicated and interesting, and it's just a rip-roaring story. It's just, I can't believe I just used that phrase, but it's fun. You've got sort of familiar-ish names, like there's a character named Hrothgar, not Hrothgar, but it's just Hrothgar, and the Neanderthal tribe are called the Wendell, so like that became Grendel over time. But it's good. If you haven't read this one, it's great. And if you haven't seen the movie version is really good too. It's one of those like rare adaptations that's genuinely really good. But it's called The 13th Warrior, and yeah, you should read this because it's a good book. The next book is Grendel by John Gardner. And I love this cover so much because you've got like Grendel, it's like this little bear guy, and he's sort of shouting at the sky as if to say like, why? I don't know, I just think it's cute. I don't know, it's kind of fun. But this book is sort of hard to describe. It's like the story of Beowulf told from Grendel's perspective, obviously, but it has like the self-awareness of like a Muppet movie. And I don't know how else to say that. Maybe a better, more modern example would be like the self-awareness of like a Deadpool movie. It's also quite violent, like a Deadpool movie. So Grendel is sort of like the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre personified, especially his book, Being and Nothingness, where he sort of talks about, his theories about like the nature of humanity and good and evil and all that stuff. And so Grendel, it's kind of satirical. It's sort of poking fun at the writings of Sartre, but Grendel is sort of a complicated character who he's violent and destructive, but he's also kind of seeking to understand how the world works and what makes the human people different from him. And it's great. It's like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's kind of like if like a Looney Tunes short was really, really gory. I don't know. This book is funny, but like in a very dark, chaotic kind of way. But we also get the dragon in this one. A lot of adaptations don't even address the dragon. And the dragon is sort of like a mentor figure to Grendel, who sort of seeks to answer his questions, but the dragon isn't very good at answering questions, and so Grendel is sort of left more confused than he was before, and so he has to kind of make up his own mind. And his mother is there also, but his mother is she's described as much more animalistic, and she's sort of a caregiver, but she's not able to answer any of his like big philosophical questions about the universe. And it's wonderful. This book is a delight. I believe it was written in like the 70s. Yeah, 1971. And I don't really know how to describe it except just read it and enjoy it. It's one of those books where it's a literary philosophical type book, but it doesn't take itself very seriously at all. It's not pretentious in any way. It's artistic and gory and beautiful, and the language is really, really good, but it's also like fun to read, and it's a really good mix of like thoughtful character work and like philosophical and literary in-jokes. So it's wonderful. This is one I would definitely recommend, especially if you're like a literature nerd or a philosophy nerd, or just really, really love books that sort of ask big questions but don't take themselves seriously enough to believe that they can answer them. This book is a delight, and I would highly recommend it. John Gardner, Grendel, read it. I love it. And finally, and I've talked about this one before, but that is The Mere Wife by Maria Devana Headley. Now, she's the one who translated the version of Beowulf that I most recently read, and I really liked this translation. It was a lot of fun. This is like, it's filled with like modern idioms, but it captures the spirit of the original story really, really well, and it's just a ton of fun to read. The wordplay and the alliteration in this is really, really good. But The Mere Wife it's an adaptation of the Beowulf story that sets the events in sort of modern day America. And it's like a post 9/11 exploration of like othering, class struggles, colonialism, the effects of PTSD, and it's all told in this sort of satirical, heightened package that is paced really, really well. You just get dragged along. And the best way I can describe this is like Edward Scissorhands meets the Stepford Wives. So it's that kind of storytelling where it's set in America, but it's very much kind of a heightened reality, and it's satirical. So it's poking fun at the institutions, especially those of like the institutions of power that are held by sort of like rich, white, upper class folks. And this, I had such a great time with this book. Grendel's mother is like a traumatized ex-Marine who is homeless, and she's struggling with mental illness following the events of the war in Afghanistan. And she's sort of living in this mountain away from, civilization. And there's this town below them of like super wealthy people, and it's all kind of this gated community where everyone there is sort of rich and influential. And her son, who's called Gren, he's just sort of a normal boy, but he sort of dreams of being able to connect with the people down below, kind of an Edward Scissorhands type thing, where he's like an outsider. He's raised by her, but he can't understand why she wants to keep him away from everyone else, because he doesn't really believe that the people are dangerous. But she's terrified of being found out, because there's this whole thing at the beginning. She was kidnapped, during the war, and was sort of given an execution on tape as a means of threatening people. But there's a lot of stuff. It's really, really good. I don't want to spoil anything. But so Grendel is just sort of a normal boy. He's just like a kid who wants to sort of connect with the people down below. And then you've got Wealhtheow and Hrothgar are Willa and Roger, and they're sort of this like the wealthy, perfect power couple, but they're both absolute disasters. It's very much like, the Real Housewives type thing, where on the surface they look very polished, put together, they live a perfect life in their perfect house with their perfect marriage, but below they're both sort of really struggling with like affairs and substance abuse and paranoia and lots of obsessive behaviors. And it's very much like a fragile balance of their life. And Beowulf is he's this cop named Ben Wolf, who's like an ex-military guy who's plagued with like body dysmorphia, and he's got this obsession with sort of recreating the heroism of his military days and all that. And so you've got Gren's curiosity of kind of going down to this town, and the meeting of these two worlds, of sort of Gren's world on the mountain and these people on the ground. When those worlds meet, all of the kind of fragile balance in both people's lives sort of starts to crack and crumble, and it just gets really crazy. It's brutal, it's hilarious, the prose is gorgeous, it's filled with tons of in-jokes. So if you've read Beowulf, or at least like know the story really well, there's lots of little references here and there that will sort of make you laugh. And one thing that I really like that this does is that it's broken up into different sections, and each section is titled as a different translation of the word that opens Beowulf. So the first word in the Old English in Beowulf is Hwat, Hwaet. And so each section sort of starts with a different way you can translate that word, because it's not a word that's very easily translatable. So it's like lo, or hark, or attend, or what, or listen, all that kind of stuff. It's so good. But this book was a delight, and I really, 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 really enjoyed it. It's chaotic and bonkers, and once you kind of understand that the world in this book is sort of a a heightened satirical version of reality, you really, I think, will enjoy it more. Because when I first started, I was very convinced it was like super realistic, and it starts off pretty brutal, and so you're very kind of grounded in that. But once you kind of start to realize just like the satire at work, it's just wonderful. There's also elements of magical realism in this, so it's just wonderful. I would highly recommend this one. This was a delight to read, beginning to end. Maria Devana Headley is incredible, and I want to read more of her work. Yes, and so I have a cat here who really wants me to pay attention to her because I'm so mean and I'm not giving her any attention. So with that said, this is Beowulf. We finished it. 4 weeks. I could go on about this for a whole lot more because there's a ton more stuff. There is also the movie version. I forgot to talk about that. I think I mentioned it in the previous one. The movie version by Robert Zemeckis. It's sort of motion capture animated. And it's good. It has some pacing issues, but it makes some kind of interesting artistic decisions about the story, but it is a pretty good adaptation. There's also the movie Beowulf and Grendel, which I think takes a more sort of realistic approach. And I haven't seen that one yet. I probably should, but I was terrified that it would be bad, so I didn't watch it. It's terrible. But anyways, Beowulf, if you want to talk more about it, let me know in the comments. I love this poem so much, and I'm always excited to talk more about it. So with that said, I will let you go, and I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.